The dragon is in troubled waters. I'm talking about China. The Chinese economy is riddled with multiple economic crises. A massive banking fraud sparked a rare show of dissent on the streets. The government is rolling out tanks against its own citizens. The numbers don't inspire much confidence either. Its largest real estate company, Evergrande, has a $300 billion debt. The local governments, they're broke. Youth is underemployed. Foreign investors, they're withdrawing. And to top it all up, there's the zero COVID policy costing people's trust. We will address all of this and more. Hello and welcome. My name is Hem Korsora and this is The Full Context. Now in China, nothing seems to be going right for the world's second largest economy. The troubles are just getting bigger. Some economists blame the pressure within the real estate sector. Some say it is the frustrations in the banking industry. Others attribute the current crisis to the zero COVID policy, accusing it of complicating existing issues. GDP data indicated a sharp slowdown in the second quarter. It ranged at 0.4% compared to the same quarter in the previous year. The latest figures indicate the softest pace of expansion since a contraction in 2020's first quarter. The world is now learning to live with COVID, but China continues to cling on to its strict measures. The detection of any COVID-19 infections has led to prolonged lockdowns of major ports and economic centers. Multiple crises started surfacing in the shutdown cities within China. The economic crisis has now snowballed. Let's talk about the biggest scam that has come to light and the subsequent visuals that brought back memories of the brutal crackdown of 1989. Visuals of tanks rolling on the streets of Chinese provinces have alarmed the world. Several clips of tanks being deployed outside banks in Henan province look starkly similar to the Tiananmen Square tragedy. So what exactly is this crisis and how bad is the situation in China? Here's what we know so far. The trouble started back in April when the rural banks in and around Henan province froze bank accounts of its customers. They were restricted from withdrawing their own money. How much did the bank freeze? More than 39 billion yuan. That is almost $6 billion that has been frozen, affecting hundreds of thousands of customers. This happened in April this year. Sporadic protests were reported from these provinces, but a major one held on the 10th of July. When over 1,000 angry customers lined up outside one of these banks demanding for their hard-earned money. Local police and men in white shirts reportedly attacked the protesters to quash dissent. A report says that data collected during the coronavirus pandemic is allegedly being used to track the protesters. Some of the dissenters said that they noticed code red on their mobile phones. Multiple people say they're being forced to quarantine, blocked from public transport or entering buildings, a way to stop the people from demonstrating. Meanwhile, officials from the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission promised that all the customers will be paid back, but it will take time as the original customer data has been removed. Several social media platforms are bombarded with visuals of tanks rolling out on the streets of China. So what really happened? Like everything in China, the problem is too discreet. The problems in Henan are partly about a case of financial wrongdoings. An investigation by China's banking regulators found that a private investment group called the Henan New Wealth Group has been illicitly siphoning off deposits from small banks. They use third-party platforms for a money broker here to take public funds. And what are Chinese authorities doing about it? Nothing yet. But an investigation is underway.
On fiscal stimulus, live continues.
本金的比例安排6000亿。 专项债券。
Now, for more clarity on this, our business editor Sumit Chaturvedi joins us. Sumit, for better clarity, can you please walk us through the multiple economic crises that China is facing currently?
Absolutely, Fahim. And beginning with the biggest crisis currently is the banking crisis. The roots of the crisis clearly lie in Henan province of China. From there were 4 rural banks, and people had millions of dollars or millions of yuan's worth investments in those banks, including investment products like FDs, fixed deposits. So after that, what happened that a particular group called Xingfao Group, that and colluded with certain people from inside the bank, took out the money of the people there. And as a result of this, 4 banks and their depositors, they were clearly in a messy situation. They couldn't take out money. That's why people came on streets as well. Communist Party's tanks were there on the street so that the overall protests don't spill over to other parts of the country, other parts of the city as well. So these are the 4 banks that were clearly involved in that kind of a problem where people couldn't get their money back, and that's why people were protesting. Thereafter, government came out and announced that 100,000 yuan or $14,800 will be paid to each one of us. These are the Zhushao Jingring Village Bank, the first bank that was in rural area, and people had deposited money there. There are other banks also whose depositors clearly were not paid by these banks because the money was taken away. So government stepped in, but at a little late time. By the time the anger was boiling, that's why people came to streets. Later on, they announced that they will be paying back money, starting from some deposits to other deposits. At a point of time, government said we can pay them at a later date. Because of all that confusion, people were clearly not aware of what was happening to their deposits, and that's when they came to streets. So there were deposits worth millions of dollars in these banks. Those were not to be paid to people. It is not a very usual sight in China where people come out in streets and ask for money, but here in this time it happened. So beginning from real estate crisis to banking crisis to COVID-19 lockdowns, we shouldn't leave this problem. COVID-19 lockdowns have been one of the strictest in entire China. People have not been able to clearly carry out activities, normal activities in a very good way. That's what has also led to some anger simmering across the country. COVID lockdowns in certain areas were strictest in fact across the world. That's what led to a lot of problems, and one of the other scams and other problems, they came to the fore. Back to you.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Now, also joining us on this broadcast is Andrew Freris, CEO of Ecognosis Advisory, joining us live from Hong Kong. Also joining us will be Danielle Lecole, Chief Economist. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us, both of you. Mr. Freris, my first question is to you. How do you assess the current banking crisis that has come to light? What do you think has triggered this, and what is your assessment of the risk involved in small rural banks in China? There's, of course, a lack of confidence now.
In the hotel in Hong Kong. I just arrived yesterday and I will be staying here for the next 7 days. Another aspect of which strict rules means. My answer has 3 parts. First, part number 1 is we must never forget that nearly more than 40% of the banking assets in China are owned by the government. That means that it can become a fiscal issue and not just a banking issue should there a crisis develop. And China right now has got a fiscal deficit of perhaps about 7%, can easily double, okay, without China in any adverse effects, because, and I'm still on my first point, we must never ever forget that China with Japan is amongst 2 biggest net world. Remember, net creditors don't go bankrupt, okay? Only net borrowers go bankrupt, like Argentina, Brazil, Greece, Russia, and so on. So China does not face a really sovereign banking problem issue. Point number 2 is of banks of which we know numbers of about 0.1%, that is 0.1% of their assets have been classified as potentially non-performing because of refusals of payment or because of issues of the security of those assets. And that's way far from the 2% red usually accepted. And the third point, of course, is that first, it started with tightening credit back in August 21, and then with a loosening of credit in July 20 from the People's Bank of China, which means, and that's my third point, that the authorities are trying to take measures. So I don't see a collapse of the banking system. My footnote, and this is very simple statistical point, is this nonsense that 5 trillion of US dollars are debts to the real estate sector, and that accounts for 35% of the GDP. It's meaningless. What really matters is the capacity of the real estate sector to service their loans, not to repay them. And also, okay, the GDP is a flow concept, is the amount of money that the country earns in a year, whereas 30 or the 5 trillion US, it's a non-flow concept. It's a sum of money. So we divide apples with bananas and we come up to a mixed fruit salad, which is meaningless. I am not saying that China doesn't have a problem. I'm saying it has a nuanced problem amongst a lot of other problems.
All right. Well, going across to Mr. Likwal now, Mr. Likwal, same question to you. What is your assessment of the current banking crisis? Mr. Freris says that it's a nuanced crisis. What is your assessment of that?
I think it's important. I think it's important because the banking system in China is absolutely critical to the development of the nation. And the government has been bailing out consistently the banking system, and obviously the official non-performing loan figure is very low, and the risks apparently seem very limited. But we must remember that China has massive capital controls. And this is a huge problem, coming back to the points that you have been mentioning in the previous part of prior to the previous interview, which is the discontent that is rising all over China because citizens simply cannot access their own savings and deposits. So one of the big problems that I think is relevant is that in the case of China, like with any other banking system, as we have seen in the past, it may bail out the real estate sector. It certainly may put some brakes to the contagion risk in the financial sector, but this doesn't alter the fact that the model of the Chinese growth in the past decade is crumbling in our view. It's not just crumbling because of inefficiency, which was shown prior, because of the enormous requirement of debt to generate one single unit of GDP, but also because the multiplier effect is generating ripple negative effects into the banking system, i.e. the insolvency is much larger than the one that appears in official figures.
All right. Oh, well, Mr. Freris and Mr. Likwal, do stay on with us. I will come back to you. Now, the banking crisis is apparently only the tip of the iceberg. The debt-laden property market is at the heart of the problem. There's a debt pile of $300 billion, and it was unleashed by the giant developer Evergrande last year. Now, Evergrande defaulted on its bond repayments, and it is now sinking the whole country. Before getting into the details, let's just take a look at this visual. These are from Shenzhen. This building is the SGG Group, the skyscraper, 72 floors high, with a total height of over 355 meters. It is the third tallest building in Shenzhen, the world's tallest concrete-filled steel tube building. The tower was completed and accepted in 2000, and this is how strong it has been in 22 years. This is the reality of China's infrastructure sector, and the real estate sector contributes more than 25% of the Chinese GDP. Over the years, China has created a structurally imbalanced economy with large exposure to real estate. As much as 78% of the household wealth is in the form of real estate holdings. Families pool in resources to buy homes, and thus house ownership has a huge significance for the Chinese people. Since last week, homeowners have been refusing to pay mortgage as developers have failed to deliver homes. 91 cities and more than 300 projects are affected. In total, the banking exposure to real estate stands at a whopping $9.2 trillion. Default by home buyers and developers will spin up major banking stress in China, which is then likely to have a global impact. Home sales collapsed by nearly 60% compared to a year ago. The current constant decline of sales is pegged to be the worst in China's history. And once again, for this, we're now being joined by our business editor, Sumit. Sumit, what can you tell us about this current real estate crisis as well?
When it started last year, it was clearly everybody was taken aback because China is not considered a market where any crisis can come. So when in 2021 Evergrande crisis came, it was clearly called the Lehman Brothers for China. Lehman Brothers 2008 crisis, the mortgage crisis of US, that shook the entire world. Then speculations were made, is Evergrande crisis another Lehman crisis in making? That time, Evergrande was $300 billion worth of debt was on the books. It was world's most indebted property developer. And clearly there was no way they were going to pay back to the people, suppliers, and even buyers. So everybody was, in a way, surprised how could Evergrande fall, to an extent that even no one was ready to buy stake in Evergrande. And from there, the crisis started to unfold. And thereafter, it was quite clear that Evergrande was not able to pay bond payments or other payments on time. Somehow, Chinese government stepped in and controlled situation to some extent, but it has not been controlled completely. Last week, its CEO and COO, they have been fired because they were routing some money from the overall this real estate company to their accounts, and that's what led to the real estate crisis, the biggest crisis of China that time. Unfinished homes in China are 225 million homes. Clearly, China has a very organized structure. There are millions of home and millions of home buyers, and that anger is there if it is not delivered on time. So mortgages they have taken is worth $9.2 trillion on these units. So they are heavily indebted by these home loans, and that's why buyers, if they don't get homes on time, they clearly come out in streets, and that was we have seen in the case of a bank crisis. So mortgage were there, and people are not now ready to take some deliveries also because they are not confident that they are shifting to safer houses. So starting from Evergrande, it is come down to other kind of property crisis. Evergrande somehow they have managed, but it's still not complete or finished yet. So there are problems that can happen in China's property sector going forward as well. Back to you, Haim, on this.
All right, Sumit, thank you so much for bringing us all those figures. Once again, we're being joined by our esteemed guests, Mr. Freris and Mr. Lacole. Thank you so much for staying on with us, Mr. Freris. Now, you did touch on this earlier, but the economic woes continue to pile up. Bearing the brunt of this is, of course, the people, especially because of the housing sector slump as well. Now, what do you say is the immediate requirement to navigate these issues?
I imagine the immediate requirement, it is the immediate policy, which is the zero COVID policy. Now, this is something that has been cast in stone by the Chinese authorities, and I imagine they have every right to stick to what they consider to be right, except it all a big question, at what stage will they be able to lift that? And in fact, expecting that at some stage China will have zero infections appears to be a little bit unrealistic. So my main concern right now is the world rightly is focusing on the fact that whereas the rest of us, in inverted commas, except Hong Kong, of course, where I'm right now, is learning to live with COVID, the Chinese authorities have decided that they will not. That may very well protract the isolation of China from the rest of the world, and of course equally impose the huge burden. In the case of Hong Kong, tourism was a component of the service sector, and it has been, for all intents and purposes, been wiped out.
Right.
And that is a deliberate policy. It is a policy issue. It has nothing to do with the market. So my main concern is to see how will the Chinese authorities see the trajectory of their policy over a period of time, and what will be the way in which it will allow them to lift the severe restrictions that have definitely knocked out several percentage points of GDP growth.
Right, but I'm going to have to ask for a clarification. So do you think that China is weaponizing its zero COVID strategy?
Weaponizing meaning what? It's exporting it to the world. Most definitely, if it is weaponized, it's an abject failure. I just came back from UK, where there's absolutely zero control. I was also in Austria, absolutely zero control. I was also in Greece, absolutely zero control. I think it's very unfair to accuse the Chinese that they are weaponizing their COVID policy. It's very much a domestic policy. Incidentally, unlike the United States, whatever happens in China stays in China. Hello, because China is not a net lender. The United States is a net borrower from the world. China is a net lender to the world. Lenders don't go bankrupt, don't have things impacted on them. Okay, China has got a huge advantage that it can stay home and does whatever it wants at home, right or wrongly, with enormous effects at home,
right,
but not external effects. Very important to emphasize that. People
right,
tend to forget it.
Right. All right, now let's just go across to Mr. Lacole. Thank you so much for patiently staying on with us. What would you say of the impact of all these issues on trade and other spheres of the economy as well?
Well, let's start by saying that the Chinese economy is not a robust economy. The Chinese economy has gone from require 1 unit of debt to generate 1 unit of GDP. In 10 years, that figure has gone to 4. The other problem of the Chinese economy is that it is not just massively indebted for a developing economy, but also that, as you very well pointed out, the size of the real estate sector is absolutely enormous compared to any other housing bubble in the recent history of developed economies. Furthermore, the big problem of the real estate sector is that real estate companies were the largest issuers of commercial paper that at the same time became the main component of saving of Chinese citizens. So the ripple effect of the Chinese real estate bubble is severely affecting the savings of numerous citizens that are seeing that their entire savings of a lifetime have been wiped out by these defaults. So a lot of people are asking themselves, is China really focusing on a zero COVID policy, or is it using a zero COVID policy to disguise a massive real estate bubble burst? And this is the largest problem of the Chinese economy, because if you look at the figures, it does not make any sense to keep the massively severe lockdowns that we have seen in the past months with the figures of infected and of deaths that they report. Today, the figures are talking about 380 people infected for a lockdown of tens of millions of people. It makes absolutely no sense from a healthcare perspective, even if we look at the way in which South Korea, in which India, in which so many countries that have adequately assessed the issues of COVID have tackled the situation. So there are big questions here. And the biggest question is what is happening to the savings of Chinese people? And the Chinese people cannot go out and complain the way that we have seen in the banks, for example, in developed economies.
Right.
Because, I have said before, they have, on the one hand, massive capital controls, and on the other hand, they have these social scores that get wiped out the moment that they complain.
Right.
So we cannot simply just say that nothing is happening. A lot is happening, and it started way before the zero COVID policy.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Mr. Lacolle. Also now to the both of you, Asian Development Bank has slashed its economic forecast for Asia. Now, before we wrap this up, what do the both of you have to say about the fallout of this economic crisis and what it means for the region? How do you see China's economic issues bleeding into those of other regional and global economies? First to you, Mr. Freris.
To the extent that a few of the Asian economies have got strong export-import relationships with China, for example, South Korea, most definitely Hong Kong, okay, then the slowdown of the Chinese economy leads invariably, okay, to a slowdown in the import-export relationship. But surprisingly enough, the trade balance of the Chinese economy has actually increased and doubled as far as the United States is concerned. In other words, net, China is exporting more to the United States than it is importing. So the export sector in China, please read my lips, was never an important component of GDP growth. Historically, it offered more than 10 basis points for every 100 basis points growth. So
Right.
The Chinese economy is a domestically driven economy. So to the extent that the net COVID policy continues to lock down and continues to impact in the economy, it will continue to slow down.
All right.
As simple as that.
Well, very quickly, let's just go across to Mr. Lacolle as well. Same question to you. What are your statements on the same?
The recent downgrades that we have seen of most of Asian economies is likely to continue. Why? Because if we look at the components of what the Development Bank has presented in terms of the growth of numerous economies, if we look at, for example, their estimates for China, the growth in the domestic sector is way higher than what one would expect with the reality of all of the things that we have said in this program. More importantly, it's not just about China. It is more about the backlash of the monster stimulus of 2020 and 2021.
All right. Well, With that, thank you so much, Mr. Ferris and Mr. Lacole, for joining us on this broadcast and your analysis of the situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, we call it a wrap on The Full Context. Thank you so much for watching.